Flight attendant demands black pilot move from first class. Then he receives an urgent call to the cockpit. Jeremiah Lewis dragged his carry-on through the jet bridge, his shoulders heavy from 3 consecutive long-haul flights, Tokyo to Dubai to London. The familiar smell of an airplane cabin wrapped around him as he stepped onto the aircraft. But something felt different this time. He wasn't in his crisp pilot's uniform with 4 stripes on the shoulders. Instead, he wore his favorite worn jeans and a navy sweater his daughter had gifted him last Christmas. 2A, just on your right. Sir, the flight attendant at the door said with a practiced smile. Jeremiah nodded, trying not to show his excitement. First class. It had been years since he'd sat there as a passenger. Usually, he spent his flights in the cockpit or occasionally in economy when traveling for leisure. Today, thanks to his accumulated miles and a lucky upgrade, he was treating himself. The leather seat felt luxurious from this side, wider, more inviting. He stowed his bag in the overhead compartment and settled in, the tension in his back already beginning to ease. Pulling out his dog-eared copy of The Shadow of the Wind, a book his wife had urged him to read for months, Jeremiah placed it on the wide armrest. Across the aisle, a businessman in an expensive suit gave him a double take, which Jeremiah pretended not to notice. 20 years of flying commercial had taught him some things changed slowly. An older woman in 2C kept stealing glances as well, her pearls clicking softly as she turned her head, likely wondering what someone like him was doing in first class. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his wife. Alana, on board. First class is nice. Might get spoiled. Asterisk asterisk. She replied almost immediately. About time. Don't forget the warm nuts. They're worth every mile we saved. Asterisk asterisk. Passengers shuffled in, the cabin filling with the usual pre-flight symphony of squeaking shoes, thumping bags, and murmured conversations. Jeremiah took a deep breath, savoring the rare moment of being a passenger with no flight plans to review, weather patterns to monitor, or crew to brief. Just 6 hours of peace between him and New York. He glanced around the cabin. A young tech entrepreneur in 1A tapped away on a MacBook. An elderly couple in 3D and 3F settled in, clearly seasoned travelers with a practiced pre-flight routine. Across the aisle, the businessman had pulled out a stack of reports, his Mont Blanc pen poised. Jeremiah opened his book, running his fingers along its worn spine. The cabin lights dimmed, creating the intimate atmosphere that made first class feel like another world. Behind him, economy passengers' muffled conversations blended into the background hum. A flight attendant moved through the cabin, offering pre-flight drinks. Welcome aboard, she said, stopping at his row. Would you care for water, orange juice, or champagne? Water would be great. Thanks, Jeremiah replied, noticing her slight surprise at his polite, well-spoken manner, another thing he was used to. Moments later, a cool glass of water appeared on his armrest, condensation already forming. Jeremiah took a sip, remembering countless times he'd been on the other side of this interaction, stopping by first class to chat with crew members during smooth flights. He pulled out the safety card from the seat pocket, a habit he couldn't break even as a passenger. Across the aisle, the businessman smiled slightly, likely thinking Jeremiah was a nervous flyer. If only he knew. Through the window, Jeremiah watched the ground crew finish their tasks. Their orange vests stood out against the gray tarmac as a luggage train snaked by, loading cargo. He admired the choreography of airport operations from this new angle. The book beckoned, and he finally allowed himself to sink into its story. The familiar sounds of the aircraft preparing for takeoff faded into a comforting hum. The seat was undeniably comfortable, and he had to admit Alana was right. He should use those miles more often. ####. Rachel Thompson, the lead flight attendant, had flown this route for 6 years. She prided herself on knowing her first-class cabin like the back of her hand. She could spot an upgraded passenger from a mile away by their awe-filled glances and clumsy fumbling with seat controls. But something about 2A caught her attention differently. Jeremiah had been quiet, reading his book, yet he lacked the usual markers of a first-class regular. No designer watch, AirPods, or expensive briefcase. Just a well-worn paperback and a simple carry-on. Sorry to bother you, Rachel said, approaching with what she hoped was a professional smile. Could I take a quick look at your boarding pass? Jeremiah looked up, calm but tired, and reached for the pass tucked in the seat pocket. Rachel noticed his hands, steady, with a plain gold wedding band. Just want to make sure everything's in order, she added. Scanning the pass. 2A, it matched, but something still nagged at her. Did you receive an upgrade today? She pressed. A few passengers nearby stopped talking. Their interest peaked. The businessman across the aisle set down his reports. The woman in pearls leaned into the aisle, clearly eavesdropping. I purchased this seat, Jeremiah said steadily. His tone carried a mix of resignation and frustration, though he didn't elaborate. It's just that sometimes there are mix-ups with seat assignments. Rachel continued, her words stumbling over the growing weight of the moment. Are you sure you're not meant to be in economy? We could check. The elderly couple exchanged glances, shaking their heads slightly. The tech guy in 1A removed his headphones. Intrigued. I'm sure, Jeremiah said firmly, holding her gaze. He didn't mention his profession or status. He didn't need to. Rachel felt heat rising to her face. The boarding pass was legitimate. She knew it was. Yet, she'd pushed. Why? Is there a problem here? Laura Chin, the head flight attendant, appeared at Rachel's elbow. Her voice was neutral, but her sharp gaze shifted between Rachel and Jeremiah. I was just double-checking the passenger's seat assignment, Rachel said, suddenly aware of how this looked. Laura glanced at the boarding pass. It clearly shows 2A. Is there any reason for concern? Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say that Jeremiah didn't look like he belonged? The realization of her bias hit her like a cold gust of wind. I apologize for the confusion, she finally managed, handing back the boarding pass. Her hands trembled slightly. Before Jeremiah could respond, Laura's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the cockpit. Mr. Lewis, Laura said in a low voice. We need you in the cockpit immediately. Jeremiah's demeanor changed instantly. He stood, the calm passenger disappearing as he moved with purpose. Rachel stepped back, watching as Laura and Jeremiah strode toward the front. Behind the curtain, the co-pilot stumbled out, pale and unsteady, assisted by other crew members. The captain's voice carried faintly, issuing quick instructions. Passengers murmured, some leaning into the aisle for a better view. The businessman frowned, the tech guy half stood, and whispers spread like wildfire. Jeremiah entered the cockpit, his voice calm and authoritative as he assessed the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, Laura announced, returning to the cabin. We have a slight delay. Everything is under control. The realization dawned across first class like ripples in a pond. The man Rachel had questioned moments earlier was an off-duty pilot stepping in during an emergency. The businessman's pin froze midair. The elderly woman adjusted her pearls with embarrassment, and the tech guy stared at the cockpit door in disbelief. Rachel stood frozen by the galley, shame washing over her. Elijah's book remained on seat 2A, its bookmark now carefully placed by a flight attendant. Her assumptions, laid bare, burned in her mind. Laura leaned in. Jeremiah Lewis is one of our senior pilots, she whispered. He's been flying with us for 20 years. He's going to get us to New York safely, just like he's done hundreds of times before. The rest of the flight passed in a haze for Rachel. Elijah and Captain Stevens worked seamlessly to guide the plane to New York. Meanwhile, Rachel moved mechanically, the weight of her earlier actions settling heavily. After landing, Jeremiah emerged from the cockpit, book in hand. Mr. Lewis, Rachel said quietly, I owe you an apology. Jeremiah studied her for a moment. Then, with a small, understanding smile, he said, awareness is the first step. It's what you do next that counts. As he walked away, Rachel resolved to do better. Later that evening, she registered for a training session on unconscious bias in aviation. Elijah's words stayed with her, a reminder that every step toward change matters. From that day forward, Rachel approached her job and the people she served with newfound humility and respect.